The airport terminal stretched endlessly before him, a gleaming monument to journeys begun and adventures awaited. Jimmy tightened the strap of his backpack, feeling the familiar weight of anticipation settle on his shoulders. This was it, the moment he had been working toward, saving for, dreaming about for 2 solid years. Sydney had been spectacular, the iconic opera house against a piercing blue sky, the chaotic energy of Darling Harbor, the surprising gentleness of kangaroos in the wild. But America was the crescendo, the solo trip, the test of his own independence, the pages of his Lonely Planet guidebook filled with highlighted attractions, from the deep dish pizza joints of Chicago to the dizzying heights of the Empire State Building. He had a return ticket booked for 3 weeks hence. This was a holiday, pure and simple, a celebration of his own hard work. The customs hall at O'Hare International was a study in organized chaos. Lines snaked toward uniformed officers stationed behind tall podiums. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and anxiety. Jimmy joined the queue for non-residents, clutching his navy blue Indian passport and the white customs declaration form he had filled out with meticulous care. Nothing to declare. No fruits, no meats, no substantial amounts of currency. Just clothes, souvenirs, and dreams. He watched the travelers ahead of him, a family with exhausted, bickering children, a businessman typing furiously on his phone, a couple holding hands, their expressions serene. He practiced his answers in his head. Purpose of visit? Tourism. Duration? 3 weeks. Place of staying? Hotel names he had memorized. He wanted to appear confident, respectful, uncomplicated. When his turn came, he stepped forward with a polite smile. The CBP officer, a woman with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, took his documents. She scanned his passport, her eyes flicking between his photo and his face. She tapped on her keyboard. Purpose of your visit, sir? Tourism, ma'am. Holiday, Jimmy replied, his voice steady. She asked the standard questions about currency, agricultural products, alcohol. He answered each no clearly. She marked his form with a quick slash of her pen and pointed a finger toward the baggage screening area. Proceed through there, sir. Welcome to the United States. A wave of relief washed over him. First hurdle cleared. He collected his suitcase from the carousel, the familiar gray hardshell he had bought specifically for this trip. It had weathered the long journey from Delhi to Sydney, and now Sydney to Chicago, with only a few new scuffs. He wheeled it toward the X-ray machines, lining up behind a group of chatty students. The machinery hummed with a low industrial purr. Bags disappeared into the dark tunnel of the scanner on a conveyor belt, emerging on the other side into the waiting hands of their owners. It was a routine he had followed a dozen times before in a dozen airports. Nothing remarkable. He placed his bag and backpack on the belt, watching them glide toward the opaque curtain. He walked through the metal detector, which remained silent, and waited on the other side for his belongings. His bag appeared. As he reached for it, a uniformed officer standing by the monitor held up a hand. "Sir, wait right there, please." The officer's expression was neutral, professional. He said something quietly to his colleague operating the screen. The second officer leaned in, zooming the image. Jimmy's stomach gave a faint, uneasy lurch. Probably just his portable charger, he told himself, or the dense souvenir paperweight from the Blue Mountains. The first officer approached him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a close-cropped haircut. "Is this your bag, sir?" "Yes, it is," Jimmy said, forcing his smile to remain. "We need to conduct a secondary inspection. Please come with me." The officer didn't ask, he instructed.
He picked up Jimmy's suitcase and led him away from the main flow of passengers, through a door marked authorized personnel only, into a narrower, brighter hallway, the sounds of the terminal muffled behind the heavy door. They entered a small, windowless room with a metal table, a single chair, and glaring fluorescent lights. Another officer was already there, pulling on a pair of blue latex gloves. The snap of the latex against his wrist was shockingly loud in the sterile space. "Place your bag on the table, sir," the first officer said. Jimmy complied, his heart beginning to drum a faster rhythm against his ribs. The gloved officer unzipped the main compartment and began removing items with methodical care. He laid them out on the table, neatly folded shirts and jeans, a dope kit with toiletries, a guidebook, a bundle of charging cables, a few Australian souvenirs, a stuffed koala, some packets of Tim Tams. Jimmy watched a silent spectator to the dismantling of his travels. Then the officer ran his hands along the interior lining of the empty suitcase. His fingers paused near the bottom seam. He pressed, feeling something. He looked at his partner, a silent communication passing between them. From a drawer, he retrieved a small, sharp utility knife. With precise movements, he inserted the tip into a nearly invisible seam in the fabric lining and sliced it open. Jimmy stared, uncomprehending. The officer reached into the opening he had created. His hand emerged holding a thick, brick-shaped package, tightly wrapped in layers of brown packing tape. He placed it on the table with a soft thud. Then he reached in again, and again. 6 identical packages, lined up on the metal surface like lethal building blocks. The white powder was visible through gaps in the tape. The room was utterly silent. Jimmy's breath caught in his throat. His brain scrambled to process the image. Those did not belong to him. He had never seen them before. They could not be in his bag. This was a mistake, a terrible, impossible mistake. What is that? He managed to whisper, his voice strangled. The officer with the gloves picked up one packet, hefting its weight. Sir, this appears to be a controlled substance, likely heroin or cocaine. Based on the size and number of packages, we're looking at approximately 3 kilograms. The words landed like physical blows. Heroin, 3 kilograms. The numbers swirled in his head. He knew what that meant. He'd seen enough movies, read enough news. This wasn't a minor infraction. This was a federal offense. This was a life sentence. That's not mine. The denial erupted from him, loud and panicked in the quiet room. I swear to God, I have never seen that before in my life. Someone must have... You have to believe me. I'm just here on holiday. His pleas echoed off the bare walls. The officer's expressions did not change. They had heard it all before. The first officer spoke, his voice flat and procedural. Jimmy Ramir, you are under arrest for the attempted importation of a Schedule I controlled substance with intent to distribute. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The Miranda rights continued, a robotic recitation that drowned out Jimmy's own frantic thoughts. This was not happening. This was a dream, a nightmare. He would wake up in his Sydney hotel bed, heart pounding, relieved. But the cold, unyielding feel of the handcuffs being fastened around his wrists was profoundly, horrifyingly real. The metal bit into his skin. The click of the lock was the final sound of his old life ending. He was turned around, guided by a firm hand on his elbow, marched back out into the hallway. They did not go back into the main terminal. They took a different route, through service corridors, past staring airport staff. He was led to a holding area within the airport. A cell, really, with concrete walls, a metal bench, and a heavy, locked door. The officer removed the cuffs only long enough for Jimmy to change into a bright orange jumpsuit. Then they were locked on again, his hands in front of him now. The door clanged shut. The sound was absolute. He was alone. The silence was deafening. He sank onto the bench, the rough fabric of the jumpsuit scratching his skin. He looked at his hands, at the gray metal encircling his wrists. 3 hours ago, he was taking a final selfie in front of the Sydney Opera House. Now he was a prisoner, a drug smuggler. The weight of the accusation, the sheer scale of the trouble he was in, crushed down on him, driving the air from his lungs. He thought of his parents in Delhi, probably asleep, unaware that their son's world had just ended. He thought of his job, his friends, his plans. All of it, gone. Replaced by the stark reality of a concrete cell and the looming specter of a federal prison. Tears, hot and shameful, finally spilled over. He was innocent, and he was utterly, terrifyingly trapped. The transition from the airport holding cell to the Cook County Jail was a descent into a different world, one Jimmy had only glimpsed in television dramas, never imagining he would inhabit. The journey was a blur of processed paperwork, more fingerprints, another mugshot where the camera captured the hollow shock in his eyes, and a humiliating medical examination. They gave him the orange jumpsuit, took his personal clothing and belongings, and issued him a thin mattress, a coarse blanket, and a plastic cup. Then he was led through a series of electronically locking gates, each metallic clang marking his passage deeper into the system. The central holding tank was a cacophony of human despair. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, stale food, and industrial cleaner. Men of all ages and backgrounds occupied benches or paced the limited floor space. Some shouted, some argued, some sat in silent, blank-eyed resignation. A television mounted high on the wall blared a daytime talk show that no one seemed to be watching. Jimmy found an empty spot against a wall and slid down to the floor, trying to make himself as small and invisible as possible. The reality of his situation settled over him like a physical weight. He was inmate number DL89423. Not Jimmy, software engineer from Delhi, traveler, son, just a number in a system that processed thousands like him. Sleep was impossible. The lights never fully went off. The noises never stopped.
The next morning, he was shuffled into a line for a breakfast of lumpy oatmeal and a piece of dry toast. He had no appetite, but he forced it down, knowing he needed strength. Later, he was taken to a small interview room to meet his court-appointed attorney. David Chen was a man in his late 40s with thinning hair and the permanently weary expression of someone carrying too many cases. He shook Jimmy's hand without warmth and opened a file. "Mr. Cantal, I've reviewed the arrest report. They found 3 kilos of high-grade heroin sewn into the lining of your suitcase. The evidence is straightforward." Jimmy leaned forward, his voice urgent. "Mr. Chen, I didn't put it there. Someone at the Sydney airport must have planted it. There was a man who bumped into me, spilled coffee." David held up a hand, cutting him off. "I've heard that story 100 times. It wasn't mine, someone else put it there. The problem is the prosecution doesn't have to prove you put it there. They only have to prove you knew it was there, or that you were in possession of the bag it was in. That's called constructive possession. And the bag was yours, you were wheeling it through customs." "But I didn't know," Jimmy insisted, desperation creeping into his tone. "How do I prove I didn't know something?" David sighed, rubbing his temples. "That's the million-dollar question. Look, the federal sentencing guidelines for this quantity are severe. The prosecutor has already floated a plea deal.
If you plead guilty to possession with intent to distribute, they'll drop the importation charge and recommend 15 years. With good behavior, you'd be out in about 10, 11 years. The numbers hung in the air between them. 15 years, 10 years. Jimmy was 28. He would be pushing 40 by the time he got out. His parents would be elderly. His career, his dreams of a family, everything, gone. The life he knew would be over. "I can't plead guilty," Jimmy whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm not guilty." David looked at him with something that might have been pity, or perhaps just professional frustration. "The system is stacked against you, Jimmy. You're a foreign national with no ties here. The judge will see you as a flight risk, so bail is unlikely. The evidence is physically in your belongings. Juries tend to believe physical evidence over a defendant's story. My job is to give you the best advice to minimize your time. Right now, that advice is to seriously consider the plea." The meeting ended shortly after. Jimmy was returned to the holding tank, David's words echoing in his mind. Minimize your time. As if losing a decade of his life was a minor inconvenience to be managed. The days blurred into a grim routine. Count times, meal times, the occasional hour in a bleak concrete yard under a wire mesh sky. He was eventually transferred to the Metropolitan Correctional Center, a federal detention facility in Chicago, to await his preliminary hearing and potential trial. The environment was more structured, more severe. His cell was a 6-by-8-foot concrete box with a metal bunk, a sink, and a toilet. His cellmate was a man named Marcus, in his 50s, with a weathered face and sharp eyes. Marcus was serving a short sentence for wire fraud. He was a talker, a predictor of the prison ecosystem. For the first few days, Jimmy kept to himself, lost in his own misery. But one night, unable to sleep, he found himself whispering his story to the darkness. He told Marcus about Sydney, about the holiday, about the arrest. Marcus listened in silence. When Jimmy finished, there was a long pause. Then Marcus spoke, his voice low. "Kid, you got played. That's a classic mule setup. They look for clean profiles. Tourists, students, people with no record traveling solo. At the departure airport, they create a distraction. A bump, a spill, someone asking for directions. While you're distracted, an accomplice switches a tag. Or more likely these days, they just inject the package right into the lining of your bag through a seam with a syringe-like tool. They use glue that sets fast. You'd never feel the difference in weight. You're the perfect patsy. If you get through, they have people on the other side to collect the bag, sometimes by stealing it from the carousel. If you get caught," Marcus let the sentence hang, "well, you're the one holding the bag, literally. They're long gone with their profit, and you're left holding the time." The clarity of the explanation was both a relief and a horror. Relief because it confirmed he wasn't crazy. There was a method to this madness. Horror because it meant he had been targeted, studied, and used with cold professional precision. He was a disposable component in a criminal enterprise. "How do I prove that?" Jimmy asked, his voice barely audible. Marcus shrugged in the dark. "You don't. Not from in here. You need a lawyer who's willing to dig, not just process paperwork. You need someone to go to Sydney, pull security footage, look for those guys. That costs money. Serious money. Money. His family was comfortable, but not wealthy. His father was a retired school principal, his mother a homemaker. They had savings, but not the kind needed for an international defense against federal drug charges. The hopelessness threatened to swallow him whole. At his preliminary hearing, the judge, citing the serious nature of the charges and his status as a foreign national with significant ties overseas, denied bail. Jimmy would remain in detention until his trial. The next phone call with his parents was the most painful experience of his life. Hearing his mother's voice crack with tears as she asked, "Beta, what happened? They're saying such terrible things." He tried to sound strong, to reassure her, but the words felt hollow, even to him. His father, ever pragmatic, asked about lawyers, about strategy. Jimmy told them about David Chen's advice, about the plea deal. There was a long silence on the line. Then his father said, "We will not let you plead guilty to something you did not do. We will find a way. We will sell the flat if we have to." The love in that statement was a lifeline, but also a source of immense guilt. He was dragging his aging parents into financial ruin for a crime he didn't commit. In the following weeks, a shift occurred within him. The initial shock and despair began to harden into a cold, simmering anger. He was angry at the faceless men who had chosen him, angry at the impersonal, grinding gears of the justice system that saw him as a case number and a statistic, angry at the injustice of it all. This anger was more useful than despair. It was fuel. He started writing everything down in a notebook provided by the jail, every detail he could remember about Sydney Airport, the time, the gate area, the description of the man in the blue cap, the woman at the check-in counter who smiled at him. He drew diagrams of where he had stood, where his bag had been. It was a futile exercise in some ways, but it gave his mind a focus. It was an act of defiance. Meanwhile, his parents had been true to their word. They contacted relatives, took loans, and managed to scrape together enough to hire a new lawyer. Her name was Anya Sharma. She was a second-generation Indian American, younger than David Chen, and specialized in wrongful conviction and complex federal cases. Her reputation was that she was brilliant, fierce, and expensive. Their first meeting was in a private attorney room visit room at the MCC. Anya Sharma was nothing like David Chen. She was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, her demeanor calm but intense. She didn't have a file in front of her. She had a tablet and a look of complete focus. "Jimmy," she said, shaking his hand firmly, "your parents have told me everything. Now I need you to tell me, from the beginning. Don't edit, don't assume something is unimportant. I need every single detail." And so he talked. For over 2 hours, he poured out everything, not just the facts of the airport, but his feelings, his fears, the crushing weight of the jail experience. She listened without interruption, her eyes never leaving his face, occasionally typing a note on her tablet. When he finished, she was silent for a full minute, thinking. "The coffee spill," she said finally. "That's the key moment. That was the diversion. In those 30 seconds, someone accessed your bag. They didn't switch it. The CCTV at O'Hare would have shown a different pack. They injected the packets into the lining. It's a known technique. Our job is not to prove who did it. Our job is to create reasonable doubt that you did it, to show the jury that there is a plausible, in fact likely explanation that doesn't involve you being a drug smuggler." For the first time since the handcuffs clicked shut, Jimmy felt a flicker of something that wasn't fear or anger. It was hope. Thin, fragile, but undeniably present. Anya stood up. "The first thing we do is reject that plea deal. Then we go to war. This will be hard, Jimmy. The prosecution has a simple story. We have to tell a more compelling one. Get some rest. I'll be in touch." She left, and Jimmy was taken back to his cell. He looked at the sliver of city skyline visible through the narrow, reinforced window.
For the first time, it didn't look like a view from a cage. It looked like a view of the battlefield. The days following Anya Sharma's visit settled into a new kind of waiting. No longer the passive, despairing wait of the condemned, but an active, anxious anticipation. Jimmy felt like a patient who had been given a diagnosis of a terminal illness, only to have a brilliant surgeon walk in and say, "There's a procedure. It's risky, but we can try." He clung to the routine of the detention center, the counts, the meals, the limited recreation time, but now his mind was elsewhere. He replayed every conversation with Anya, analyzed every detail he had given her, and wondered what she was doing on the outside. Was she talking to experts? Was she in Sydney? Had she found something? The uncertainty was its own special torture, but it was preferable to the absolute certainty of defeat that David Chen had offered. Marcus, his cellmate, observed the change in him. "You got yourself a fighter, huh?" he remarked one evening, leaning against the wall of their cell. "I can see it in your eyes, that spark. Just don't let it burn you out, kid. This system grinds slow, real slow." Jimmy nodded. He knew Marcus was right. The legal machinery was ponderous, designed to be thorough to the point of exhaustion. Anya's first move was a blizzard of legal paperwork, motions filed with the court, a motion to compel discovery, demanding the prosecution hand over every scrap of evidence, the complete forensic report on the drugs and the packaging, all lab notes, the chain of custody documents, the original CCTV footage from O'Hare's baggage claim and screening area. Another motion for funds to hire an investigator and a forensic expert, arguing that the complexity of the case and Jimmy's indigent status warranted it. The prosecution, as expected, resisted. They claimed the discovery was complete, that further investigation was unnecessary, that the case was straightforward. Anya pushed back harder. In a hearing before the trial judge, a stern woman named Judge Evelyn Walker, Anya was a different person from the calm listener in the visitation room. She was incisive, prepared, and relentless. Your Honor, the government's entire case rests on proximity. The drugs were in a bag Mr. Lomamata was carrying. That's it. They have no evidence of prior involvement in drug trafficking, no suspicious financial transactions, no communications with known dealers. They haven't even bothered to check if his story about the Sydney airport diversion has any merit. That's not justice, that's convenience. My client has a constitutional right to present a defense, and to do that, we need the resources to investigate the very real possibility that he was set up. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man named Andrew Miller with a preeminently skeptical expression, countered. Your Honor, this is a standard smuggling case. The defendant was caught red-handed with a significant quantity of a deadly drug. His set-up story is the oldest one in the book. Granting funds for an international fishing expedition is a waste of court resources. Judge Walker listened, her face unreadable. After a few moments of consideration, she ruled. I'm granting the motion for additional discovery, Mr. Miller. Provide everything to the defense. I'm also granting in part the motion for funds. Ms. Sharma, you may retain a forensic packaging expert. The request for an international investigator is denied at this time. You may submit subpoenas for any foreign evidence through proper channels. It was a partial victory, but a significant one. Anya had pried open a door. The forensic report when it arrived was dozens of pages of technical jargon. But Anya, with the help of the expert she hired, a former DEA agent named Dr. Eris Thorne, found the gold. It was on page 17, in a subsection about trace evidence on the packaging.
The adhesive binding the brown packing tape is a polyurethane-based industrial brand, Seal-Tight 9000, Dr. Thorne explained to Jimmy and Anya during a conference call. Common in shipping warehouses across Southeast Asia and Australia, not something your average tourist buys at a stationery store. More importantly, on page 22, a partial latent fingerprint, approximately 40% usable, was recovered from the interior surface of the primary plastic bag, beneath the tape. This print does not match the defendant's known prints. Anya's voice was electric with excitement. Jimmy, do you understand what this means? The person who packaged those drugs, who handled the actual plastic bag before it was taped, left a fingerprint, and it wasn't you. The prosecution's own evidence proves someone else physically handled the contraband. Jimmy felt a surge of hope so powerful it made him dizzy. So that's it? They have to drop the charges? Anya's tone became cautious. No, unfortunately, it's not that simple. Miller will argue the print could be from a factory worker where the bags were manufactured, or a handler somewhere in the supply chain before it even got to the people who set you up. It creates doubt, but it doesn't eliminate their constructive possession theory. You were still in possession of the bag it was in. But it's our first solid piece of evidence that your story might be true. She paused. Now we need the second piece. We need the Sydney footage. Getting the CCTV footage from Sydney Kingsford Smith Airport was a legal and logistical nightmare. Australian privacy laws, the sheer volume of footage, the fact that most routine surveillance was automatically overwritten after 30 days, they were months past that window. Anya worked the formal channels, filing international mutual legal assistance requests, but the process was glacial. Meanwhile, the trial date was set, only 4 months away. Time was slipping away. In a calculated gamble, Anya used the remaining funds from Jimmy's family to hire a private investigator in Sydney, not through official court channels, but privately. His name was Joe Weller, a former Australian federal police officer with a network of contacts. Anya sent him the detailed description Jimmy had written, the date, the approximate time, Terminal 1, the check-in area near the Qantas desks, the coffee shop where the spill happened. It was a needle in a haystack. Weeks passed with no word. The pressure mounted. Pre-trial hearings focused on what evidence would be admissible. Miller fought to keep the partial fingerprint out, calling it irrelevant and prejudicial. Anya fought to include it, arguing it went directly to the heart of the defense, that others were involved. Judge Walker ruled it admissible. The jury may assign it whatever weight they deem appropriate, she said, but it is relevant to the issue of knowledge and possession. It was another win, but a technical one. They needed something visceral, something a jury could see. Then, late one night, Jimmy was called to the phone. It was Anya, her voice tight with controlled excitement. Joe found something, she said without preamble. It's not perfect, it's grainy, it's from a camera at a bad angle, and it only shows about 20 seconds. But it shows you, and it shows the bump. She explained that Joe's contact, a security supervisor who remembered the case from news reports, had managed to pull a fragment from an archived backup drive. The footage was from a camera pointing at a seating area near a coffee kiosk. It shows you sitting, your gray bag at your feet. A man in a dark blue cap walks into frame, carrying a tray with 2 coffees. He stumbles, seemingly over his own feet, and the coffees go flying, right near your bag.
You look up, startled. At that exact moment, another man, dressed in a gray hoodie, sits at the table immediately next to yours. His own identical gray suitcase is placed right beside yours, touching it.
He's there for maybe 12, 15 seconds. He fiddles with his phone, then gets up and walks away, taking his back. The man in the blue cap apologizes, mops up some of the mess with napkins, and leaves. You go back to looking at your phone. Jimmy listened, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could see it in his mind's eye. The chaotic moment he had dismissed as bad luck was, in fact, a meticulously choreographed criminal act. Can they enhance it? See their faces? The quality is too poor for facial recognition, Anya said, but that's not the point. The point is the sequence, the coordination, the identical bags making contact. A jury can see that. They can see this wasn't an accident. It was a tactic. She took a deep breath. This changes everything, Jimmy. We now have a narrative. We have a how. The fingerprint shows someone else packaged the drugs. This footage shows how they likely got into your bag. We can put you on the stand and your story won't just be your word against the drugs. It will be your word, supported by their own forensic evidence and by video of the setup in action. For the first time since his arrest, Jimmy allowed himself to truly believe he might walk out of this courtroom a free man. The feeling was terrifying in its intensity. He returned to his cell that night and looked out the window. The city lights seemed brighter, closer. The battlefield Anya had spoken of was coming into view. He could see the opposing army, the physical evidence, the skeptical prosecutor, the sheer inertia of the system. But now he could also see his own weapons being unloaded, the fingerprint, the footage, and Anya Sharma's brilliant, determined mind. The trial was no longer an inevitable march to conviction. It was a fight, and for the first time he felt like he had a fighting chance. Marcus noticed the change immediately. "You look like a man who just got some good news," he said, a knowing glint in his eye. Jimmy simply smiled. It was a real smile, the first one in months that reached his eyes. He didn't say anything. He just sat on his bunk, closed his eyes, and began mentally preparing for the war to come. He rehearsed his testimony in his head. He imagined the jury's faces. He visualized walking out of the courthouse, the sun on his face, the weight of the orange jumpsuit gone forever. The hope was no longer a flicker, it was a flame, and he was determined to fan it into an inferno that would burn down the prosecution's entire case. The morning of the first day of trial dawned gray and cold, a typical Chicago winter day. Inside the sterile confines of the Metropolitan Correctional Center, Jimmy was given his civilian clothes, the same jeans and sweater he had been arrested in, now feeling strangely loose on his thinner frame. Anya had arranged for a proper suit to be brought to the courthouse. The journey to the Everett M. Dirksen United States Courthouse was made in a windowless van, handcuffed and shackled, accompanied by 2 federal marshals. It was a humiliating, claustrophobic ride that reinforced his status as a dangerous criminal in the eyes of the state. The marshals were professional and silent. At the courthouse, he was taken through a secure underground entrance, up in a special elevator, and into a holding cell adjacent to the courtroom. There, the marshals removed his shackles and allowed him to change into the suit Anya had provided. It was a dark charcoal gray, well-tailored, but it hung on him. The months in detention had hollowed him out. He looked at himself in the small mirror. His face was thinner, older. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before, but his gaze, for the first time, was steady. Anya arrived, looking every bit the warrior in a crisp black suit. She carried a large litigation bag and an aura of focused energy. "Ready?" she asked, her eyes searching his. He nodded. "As I'll ever be." "Remember," she said, her voice low and intense. The jury isn't seeing inmate DL89423. They're seeing Jimmy, a young man far from home, caught up in something he doesn't understand. Be respectful, be clear. When you're on the stand, look at them. Tell the truth. The evidence is on our side now. The door to the courtroom opened. A bailiff called, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Evelyn Walker." The courtroom was grand and intimidating, all dark wood, high ceilings, and the solemn seal of the United States District Court behind the judge's bench. It was nothing like the chaotic courtrooms on TV. The silence was profound, heavy with consequence. Judge Walker entered, her black robes flowing, and took her seat. "Be seated," she said, her voice clear and commanding. Jimmy sat at the defense table beside Anya. At the adjacent table sat Prosecutor Andrew Miller and 2 young assistants. Miller didn't look at him. He was organizing files, exuding an air of bored confidence. To the right, in the jury box, sat 12 men and women who held his fate in their hands. They looked ordinary, a mix of ages, races, backgrounds. Some looked curious, some bored, some serious. He tried to make eye contact,
to project innocence, but his heart was pounding so hard he feared they could hear it. The formalities began. Judge Walker gave the jury preliminary instructions. Then Andrew Miller stood for his opening statement. He walked slowly to the lectern in front of the jury box, a picture of calm authority. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice practiced and smooth. "This is a simple case. It's not about mystery novels or international conspiracies. It's about responsibility. On December 2nd, the defendant, Jimmy, arrived at O'Hare International Airport on a flight from Sydney, Australia. When his bag went through the X-ray machine and alerted, customs officers inspected it. And what did they find? Not souvenirs, not clothes. They found 6 packages containing 3 kilograms of nearly pure heroin." He paused, letting the weight of the number sink in. 3 kilograms. That's enough to destroy thousands of lives, to fuel addiction, violence, and despair in our communities. The defendant had it in his bag. He was its custodian. He was attempting to bring this poison into our country. The evidence will show you the bag was his boarding pass, his name tag, his clothes inside. The evidence will show you the drugs were expertly concealed in a hidden compartment. The law is clear. If you possess it, you are responsible for it. At the end of this trial, the evidence will lead you to one inescapable conclusion, that Jimmy J is guilty of the crime with which he is charged. Thank you. It was effective, simple, direct, and damning. Miller returned to his seat without a glance at the defense table. Anya stood. She approached the jury not with Miller's prosecutorial swagger, but with a calm, deliberate intensity. She stood beside the lectern, making herself closer to them, more human. "Good morning," she said, her voice firm but not harsh. "Mr. Miller is right about one thing. This is a simple case, but he has the simplicity backwards. This isn't a case about a smuggler who got caught. This is a case about a tourist who got framed." She let the word hang in the quiet room. Jimmy saved for 2 years for a dream holiday. He went to Australia. He saw the sights. And on his way to visit America, his dream was stolen from him. Not by bad luck, but by criminals. Professional criminals who make their living by preying on innocent travelers. They look for people like Jimmy, people traveling alone, people who look trusting. And at the Sydney airport, they targeted him. They created a diversion. And in a matter of seconds, they planted 3 kilograms of heroin in his suitcase, without his knowledge. She walked slowly along the jury box, making eye contact with each juror. "The evidence will show you that the fingerprint on the inside of that drug bag is not Jimmy's.
It belongs to someone else. The evidence will show you grainy but clear footage from Sydney Airport of a coordinated 2-man operation happening right beside Jimmy as he sat unsuspecting. The evidence will show that Jimmy had a return ticket, that he had no history of any crime, that he had no reason to throw his entire life away." She stopped, turning to face them fully. "Mr. Miller will ask you to convict Jimmy based on one fact. The drugs were in his bag. We will ask you to look at all the facts, the how, the who else, the complete lack of any motive. When you look at everything, you will be left with a reasonable, persistent doubt. And in our system, when there is reasonable doubt, you must return a verdict of not guilty. Because convicting an innocent man isn't justice, it's a tragedy. And Jimmy has already suffered enough tragedy. Thank you." She returned to her seat, giving Jimmy's arm a subtle, reassuring squeeze under the table. The trial proper began. The prosecution called its witnesses. The CBP officers who made the arrest testified, describing the X-ray alert, the inspection, the discovery. Their testimony was dry, factual, devastating. The forensic chemist from the DEA lab took the stand, explaining the testing process, confirming the substance was heroin of high purity, detailing the weight. Each piece of evidence was entered, the drug packages themselves, sealed in clear evidence bags, the suitcase, Jimmy's passport and boarding pass. Miller built his wall brick by brick. It was a solid, imposing wall. Jimmy watched, feeling the jury's eyes on him as each piece of incriminating evidence was presented. He kept his expression neutral, as Anya had instructed. Inside, he was screaming. During cross-examination, Anya went to work. She didn't challenge the facts of the discovery. Instead, she subtly shifted the focus. To the arresting officer. "Officer, when you initially approached Mr. Clarinet, what was his demeanor?"
He seemed confused, sir. Not evasive, not nervous in a guilty way, just confused? I suppose. And when you found the drugs, what did he say? He said they weren't his, that it was a mistake. He immediately denied knowledge? Yes. Did he try to run? Did he become aggressive? No. To the forensic chemist. Doctor, you tested the packaging for fingerprints, correct? Yes. And you found a usable partial print on the interior layer of plastic, correct? That is correct. And that print did not match my client's prints provided by the government, correct? That is correct. So someone other than Jimmy Clairnett handled the actual plastic bag that contained the heroin before it was sealed in tape. Objection. Speculation as to when the print was deposited. Sustained. But the seed was planted. Anya moved on. The adhesive on the tape, you identified it as Seal Tight 9000? Yes. And that is an industrial-grade adhesive typically used in shipping and warehouses? It can be, yes. Not something commonly found in a home or a tourist's luggage repair kit. Objection. Relevance. Overruled. The witness may answer. I am not familiar with its common retail availability. Each cross-examination was a small chisel, tapping away at the solidity of the prosecution's wall, not breaking it down, but creating hairline fractures. After the prosecution rested its case, Anya began hers. Her first witness was Dr. Eris Thorne, the forensic packaging expert. He explained in clear terms how drug trafficking organizations often use blind mules. He described the diversion and plant technique, showing diagrams. He testified that the fingerprint evidence was highly significant because it indicated at least 2 individuals were involved in the preparation of the contraband that ended up in Jimmy's back. Miller's cross was aggressive, trying to paint Thorne as a hired gun for the defense, but the man was unflappable. Then came the pivotal moment.
Anya called the security consultant who had analyzed the Sydney footage. A screen was set up in the courtroom. The grainy, silent black and white video began to play. Jimmy watched himself on screen, looking relaxed, checking his phone. Then the man in the blue cap entered. The spill, the chaos. And there, clear as day, the man in the gray hoodie placing his identical bag right next to Jimmy's. The contact, the brief wait, the departure. The entire sequence took less than 30 seconds. The consultant narrated, pointing out the coordinated timing, the body language, the professional efficiency of it. This is a known smuggling technique, he stated. The identical bags allow for a plausible deniability if questioned. The contact is long enough to transfer a tracking device, or in this case, as the defense contends, to inject a substance through a pre-cut seam. The courtroom was utterly silent. Every juror was leaning forward, eyes glued to the screen. When the video ended, the impact was palpable. Miller's cross-examination was furious but strained. He argued the footage proved nothing. It could be a coincidence, the men could be unrelated. But his arguments sounded weak, desperate, against the compelling visual narrative. Finally, it was time. Anya turned to the judge. The defense calls Jimmy Quar to the stand. Jimmy stood. He smoothed his suit jacket, took a deep breath, and walked to the witness stand. The walk felt endless. He swore the oath, his voice clear. He sat down, facing Anya, but his eyes kept drifting to the jury. They were all looking at him. This was it, his chance to tell his story, not from a jail cell or a legal brief, but directly to the people who would decide his future. Anya began with soft, easy questions, walking him through his life in Delhi, his job, his saving for the trip, his excitement. She made him human again. Then she led him to that day in Sydney. He told the story, looking at the jurors. He described the man in the blue cap, the shock of the hot coffee spilling near him, the brief moment of annoyance, the man's apologies. He described going through security, the flight, the arrival in Chicago, the growing unease at customs, the shock of the discovery, the utter terror of the arrest. He spoke of his confusion, his desperation, his certainty that a terrible mistake had been made. He did not cry, but his voice thickened with emotion when he spoke of calling his parents from jail. He was raw, he was honest, and he was compelling. When Anya finished, she simply said, "No further questions." Andrew Miller stood for cross-examination. He approached the witness stand like a predator. "Mr. Quar," he began, his voice dripping with skepticism. "That's quite a story. A Hollywood story, really. Convenient, mysterious men, convenient video footage. But let's talk about facts. The drugs were in your bag, correct?" "They were found in my bag, yes, but I didn't put them there." "You expect this jury to believe that a sophisticated drug smuggling operation, as your lawyer describes, just happened to pick you out of the thousands of people at that airport? I don't know why they picked me, but they did. Isn't it more likely, Mr. Quar, that you knew exactly what was in your bag, that you agreed to transport it for money, that the dream holiday was just a cover?"
Jimmy looked directly at Miller, then at the jury. No, sir. That is not true. I had money saved. I had a job to return to. I had a family. I would never risk all of that. I didn't know the drugs were there. The cross-examination went on, Miller hammering at the impossibility of the setup, the improbability. Jimmy held firm. He admitted what he didn't know. He didn't try to outsmart the prosecutor. He just told the truth, again and again. I don't know. I didn't see that. All I know is I didn't do it. By the time Miller finished, he seemed frustrated. Jimmy had not broken. He had not contradicted himself.
He stepped down from the stand, his legs trembling slightly. The final witnesses were character witnesses, a former professor from India who spoke of his integrity, a family friend. Then both sides rested. The evidence was in. The case was now in the hands of 12 strangers. Closing arguments were scheduled for the next day. That night, back in his cell, Jimmy didn't feel triumph. He felt exhausted, emptied out. He had done everything he could. He had told his truth. Now he had to wait. The longest night of his life had just begun. The night before closing arguments was a crucible of silence and shadow in the federal detention cell. Jimmy lay on his bunk, staring at the familiar cracks in the ceiling that had become a map of his confinement. But tonight, the map told no story of escape or hope. It was simply a ceiling, a barrier between him and the sky, between him and the verdict that would define the rest of his life. The adrenaline that had carried him through his testimony had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, brittle exhaustion. Every moment of the trial replayed in his mind on a relentless loop. The damning weight of the drug packets on the evidence table, the grainy, ghostly dance of the men in the Sydney footage, the feel of the jury's eyes upon him, probing, judging, weighing. He could hear Andrew Miller's skeptical, cutting voice. You expect this jury to believe. He could feel the steadiness of Anya's gaze willing him strength from the defense table. He relived the surreal out-of-body sensation of speaking from the witness stand, watching his own life being dissected as a legal exhibit. Sleep was a distant country. His body was rigid with a tension that had nothing to do with the hard mattress. It was the tension of a bowstring drawn back for months, waiting for the arrow to be loosed. Tomorrow, the arrow would fly. Would it hit the target of justice, or would it veer wildly into the abyss? He thought of his parents, in a budget hotel near the courthouse, likely also awake, praying to gods in a language he feared this American courtroom didn't speak. The guilt of their mortgaged home, their shattered peace, was a heavier chain than the one he'd worn in the transport van. Marcus, in the bunk below, was uncharacteristically quiet, respecting the sanctity of this last vigil. Just before the lights were dimmed for the night, he spoke into the darkness, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. You did good up there, kid. You looked him in the eye. That's all a man can do. The rest is in the hands of fools and fate. Jimmy said nothing. He just kept staring at the cracks, tracing them with his mind until they blurred into meaningless lines. Dawn came gray and indifferent. The ritual repeated. The van, the shackles, the holding cell, the suit that hung like a borrowed skin. Anya met him, her eyes sharp with a fierce, protective energy. She looked like she hadn't slept either, but her exhaustion was forged into steel. This is it, she said, handing him a glass of water. Today we bring it all together. You've done your part. Now I do mine. Just sit there. Look at the jury. Listen. Believe in the story we've told. He nodded, the simple motion feeling monumental. The courtroom felt different when they entered. It was charged, electric with finality. The air was thinner. The jurors filed in, their faces now familiar, yet utterly inscrutable. Were they the faces of his salvation or their condemnation? He searched for clues, a sympathetic glance, a frown of doubt, but found only a collective mask of solemn attention. Judge Walker took the bench. Counsel, are you ready for closing arguments? The United States is ready, Your Honor, Miller said. The defense is ready, Anya replied. Andrew Miller went first. He approached the jury box without notes, a show of confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his tone of a reasonable man stating the obvious.
Over the last week, you have heard a story, a fanciful story, a story about international criminal masterminds, about secret fingerprints and shadowy figures in airports. It's a compelling narrative. It might even make a good movie. He paused, a slight, dismissive smile on his lips. But this isn't a movie. This is a federal courtroom, and here we deal with facts. Concrete, tangible, undeniable facts. He walked to the evidence table and picked up one of the clear plastic bags containing a brick of heroin. He held it up, letting the stark reality of it fill the juror's vision. Fact: 3 kilograms of heroin. Fact: this heroin was found concealed in a hidden compartment. Fact: that hidden compartment was in this suitcase. He pointed to Jimmy's gray suitcase on the table. Fact: that suitcase belonged to Jimmy. His boarding pass was tied to it. His clothes were inside it. He was wheeling it through customs. He put the drug packet down with a soft, definitive thud. The defense wants you to look away from these facts. They want you to focus on a blurry video from another country. They want you to focus on a partial fingerprint that could have come from anywhere. They are weaving a tapestry of maybe and what if to obscure the simple, powerful truth right in front of you. He turned and pointed directly at Jimmy. He had the drugs. He is responsible. The law doesn't require you to find a motive. It doesn't require you to understand why he did it. It only requires you to find that he did it. And the evidence that he did it is overwhelming. He walked back to the lectern, his voice dropping to a tone of grave responsibility. Don't be distracted by the fiction. Do your duty. Hold him accountable for the poison he tried to bring into our community. Find him guilty. He returned to his seat. The spell he cast was one of simplicity and weight. He had reduced the complex, terrifying ordeal of the last months to an equation. Bag plus drugs equals guilt. It was terrifyingly persuasive. Anya stood. She did not immediately walk to the lectern. She took a moment, standing by the defense table, letting the silence stretch, allowing the jury to shift their focus from Miller's certainty to her. She carried no props. She simply walked to the jury box and stood before them, her hands at her sides. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice clear and calm, but carrying to every corner of the still room. "Mr. Miller is right about one thing. This is about facts. So let's look at all the facts, not just the convenient ones." She began to tick them off on her fingers. Fact: Jimmy Girma had a return ticket to India, booked and paid for. Fact: he had no criminal record, here or in India, not a parking ticket. Fact: he had a good job, a loving family, a life that anyone in this room would recognize as normal, decent. Fact: the government's own forensic report shows a fingerprint on the inside of that drug packet that is not Jimmy's. Someone else handled that plastic. Fact: the video from Sydney Airport shows a coordinated two-man operation targeting Jimmy's bag at the precise moment he describes. She paused, her gaze sweeping across each juror's face. Now, Mr. Miller asks you to believe that this young man, with everything to lose, decided on a whim to become an international drug courier, that he somehow acquired 3 kilograms of heroin in Australia, a country he was visiting for the first time, that he then expertly sewed it into the lining of his own bag, a bag he would have to surrender at check-in, go through security with, and claim at baggage reclaim, that he did all this to, what? To fund a 3 weeks holiday he had already saved for? She shook her head slowly, a gesture of profound disbelief. That story doesn't just require suspension of disbelief. It requires the abandonment of common sense. She stepped closer. The reasonable story, the story supported by the evidence, is the one Jimmy told you from that very stand. He was a mark, a target.
He was chosen because he looked like what he is, an honest tourist. The criminals who did this are professionals. They've done it before. They'll do it again. They are counting on the system doing exactly what Mr. Miller is asking you to do. See the drugs, see the bag, stop thinking. They are counting on an innocent man taking the fall so they can remain free to destroy more lives with their poison. Her voice gained intensity, not through volume, but through passionate conviction. You are not just deciding Jimmy's fate today. You are deciding what kind of justice system we have. Is it a system that looks deeply, that questions, that demands more than just proximity? Or is it a system that operates on autopilot, that convicts on the easiest, most superficial reading of the facts? Jimmy has already lost a year of his life to this nightmare. Don't make him lose the rest. Look at all the evidence. See the doubts that are woven through the prosecution's own case. And if you see those doubts, reasonable, serious doubts, then you must, under your oath, return the only verdict justice allows, not guilty. She didn't say thank you. She simply gave them one final, long look, as if transferring the full weight of her belief in her client onto their shoulders, and returned to her seat. The silence was profound. Judge Walker gave the jury their final instructions, the definition of reasonable doubt, the elements of the crime, the cold, precise language of the law. Then she said the words, "The jury will now retire to deliberate." The 12 men and women stood and filed out of the courtroom. The door to the jury room closed behind them with a soft click. And then the wait began. Jimmy was taken back to the holding cell. Anya came in briefly. "It's out of our hands now," she said, her professional armor showing its first hairline crack. She looked weary to her bones. "We gave them everything. We gave them a better story. Now we wait." The first hour was agony. Every minute stretched into an eternity. He paced the small cell, 3 steps one way, 3 steps back. He played the closings over in his head. Miller's simplicity versus Anya's complexity. Which would resonate? Would the jury be swayed by the visceral impact of the drugs or by the chilling logic of the setup? The second hour, the third. Lunchtime came and went. He couldn't eat.
Anya checked in periodically, her face tight. No note yet. Deliberation is good. Quick verdicts are usually guilty. The 4th hour, the 5th. The tension became a physical thing, a tight band around his chest, a metallic taste in his mouth. He thought of the jury room. Were they arguing? Was one holdout fighting for him? Or were they all united, quickly convicted of his guilt, now just dotting I's and crossing T's? He prayed, not to any specific deity, but to the universe, to fate, to the concept of justice itself. Please, please. The marshals brought him dinner. He ignored it. The light outside the small high window faded from gray to black. Night. They had been deliberating for over 8 hours. Anya came in, her face pale. Judge Walker is about to sequester them for the night. They'll be taken to a hotel. Deliberations resume tomorrow. A night of deliberation meant uncertainty. It meant conflict. It was neither the quick conviction he feared, nor the swift acquittal he desperately hoped for. It was purgatory, extended. The night in the detention cell was worse than the one before. Now his fate was literally in a room somewhere, being debated by 12 strangers sleeping in hotel beds. He imagined their dreams, wondered if he was in them. The next morning, the process repeated. The van, the courthouse, the suit, the holding cell. The wait resumed. 9 a.m., 10 a.m., 11 a.m. Each passing moment was a tiny erosion of hope. The longer they took, the more he convinced himself they were struggling to convict, that they wanted to find him guilty, but the doubts Anya planted were holding them back.
Was that good? Or did it just mean they would eventually cave to the pressure of the physical evidence? At 11:47 a.m., a marshal knocked on the holding cell door. They've reached a verdict. The 2 words sent a jolt through his system so violent he thought he might be sick. A verdict. It was over. The journey ended here, in this hallway, outside a wooden door. Anya appeared, gripping his arm. "Remember," she whispered, her voice fierce. "No matter what happens, you stay calm. You are innocent. Remember that." They walked into the courtroom. It was fuller now. Some reporters had returned, sensing the end. His parents were in the front row of the gallery. His mother's face was a mask of tear-streaked agony, her hands clasped in prayer. His father sat rigidly, holding her. Jimmy couldn't meet their eyes. He focused on the defense table, on the grain of the wood. "All rise." The jury filed in. He dared a glance. Their faces were closed, tired, revealing nothing. No one looked at him. Was that a bad sign? The judge addressed the foreperson, a middle-aged woman in a green sweater. "Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." The clerk took the verdict form. The rustle of the paper was the loudest sound in the universe. Time dilated. Jimmy saw everything in hyper-clarity. The dust motes in a shaft of light from the high window, a chip in the wood of the judge's bench, the nervous tap of Andrew Miller's pen. He heard the blood roaring in his ears. The clerk cleared her throat. Her voice, when it came, was neutral, bureaucratic. "In the case of the United States of America versus Jimmy Vates, on the sole count of attempted importation of a controlled substance with intent to distribute, we, the jury, find the defendant." A heartbeat that lasted a lifetime. Not guilty. For a full second, there was absolute silence, as if the words had to travel a vast distance to be understood. Then a sharp, gasping sob from his mother, a collective exhale from the room. Anya's hand clamped down on his shoulder, her nails digging in. "Yes," she hissed, "yes." Judge Walker's gavel panged once. "The defendant is released from custody. This court is adjourned." The words washed over him, not as sound, but as a physical sensation. A lifting. The weight that had crushed him for a year, the weight of the cell, the jumpsuit, the accusation, the terror, simply vanished. He felt lightheaded, unmoored. He turned to Anya. She was smiling, a real, wide, triumphant smile, tears in her eyes. She hugged him tightly. "You're free, Jimmy, you're free." He looked over at his parents. His mother was weeping openly, held by his father, who was nodding over and over, as if confirming the reality to himself. The marshals approached, not to cuff him, but to process his release. Andrew Miller packed his briefcase without looking at anyone and left the courtroom. The world had turned upside down. The walk out of the courthouse was a blur. There were a few flashing cameras, shouted questions he didn't hear. Anya shepherded them to a waiting car. He sat in the back seat between his parents, their hands clutching his. He looked out the window at the streets of Chicago, at people walking, cars driving, life proceeding normally. He was part of it again. He was free. But as the car pulled away from the curb, a strange emptiness began to seep into the spaces where the terror had been. The fight was over. He had won. So why did he feel so utterly, completely lost? The first days of freedom were a disorienting parody of the life he remembered. The hotel room his parents had rented felt impossibly large, luxurious, and quiet. The silence was different from the tense, fearful quiet of the cell. It was a hollow, echoing silence that seemed to amplify the noise still roaring inside his head.
He slept for 14 hours straight and woke up not refreshed but dislocated, unsure of where he was. His body braced for the morning count.
The shower ran with endless hot water, and he stood under it until his skin pruned, trying to scrub away a residue that wasn't on his skin, but in his soul. The clothes his parents had bought for him, soft cotton, new jeans, felt alien against his body, which still carried the memory of the coarse orange jumpsuit. His parents treated him with a fragile, heartbreaking tenderness, as if he were a glass sculpture that might shatter at a sudden sound. They made his favorite foods, spoke in hushed tones, and watched him with eyes full of a love so mingled with pain it was almost too much to bear. He was grateful, but he felt like a ghost in their midst, a visitor from a terrible land they could never truly understand. The practicalities of freedom were a mountain to climb. Anya handled the immediate legal loose ends, but there was more. His visa was technically invalidated by the arrest. His belongings, aside from the suitcase that was evidence, had to be retrieved from storage. His return flight to India had long since departed. The life he had put on pause a year ago could not simply be resumed with the press of a button. It was corrupted, scattered. But the external chaos was nothing compared to the internal wreckage. The nightmares began almost immediately, not of the trial or the jail, but of the airport. In his dreams, he was always in a terminal, but the signs were in gibberish. The gates led nowhere, and his suitcase, his faithful gray suitcase, would slowly unzip itself to reveal not clothes, but a gaping, dark void that threatened to swallow him whole. He would wake up gasping, the sheets damp with sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs as if trying to escape a cage that was no longer there. He became hyper-vigilant in crowds. A dropped tray in a restaurant cafeteria made him flinch violently, scanning for a man in a blue cap. The sound of a siren, even in the distance, sent a jolt of primal fear through his system. He found himself automatically assessing exits, measuring the trustworthiness of strangers, a habit forged in survival mode that had outlived its purpose. The world was no longer a place of potential adventure. It was a landscape of potential threats. The media attention was brief but brutal. Innocent tourist freed in drug smuggling case made for a one-day headline. He gave one short, strained statement written by Anya, expressing gratitude to his lawyer and family and asking for privacy to heal. Then he and his parents checked out of the hotel and quietly flew to New York, staying with a distant cousin, hiding from the fleeting spotlight. It was there, in the anonymous bustle of Queens, that the numbness began to thaw into a raging, directionless anger. He was angry at the faceless men who had chosen him. He was angry at the system that had so readily presumed his guilt, that had locked him away for a year without a second thought. He was angry at the lost time, the stolen joy, the innocence he could never reclaim. He was angry that he had to be grateful for an outcome that should have been a given, his freedom. He was angry that the victory felt so much like defeat. One night he broke down in the cousin's tiny backyard. He didn't cry, he raged. He slammed his fist against the brick wall until his knuckles bled, a silent, furious tantrum against the universe. His father found him there, took his bleeding hand without a word, and led him inside to clean and bandage it. The simple, practical act of care broke through the anger, and then the tears came, great, heaving sobs that shook his entire body. He cried for the year he lost, for the fear, for the humiliation, for the person he was before the handcuffs clicked shut, a person who was gone forever. His father just held him, saying nothing, his own tears falling into Jimmy's hair. It was the beginning of the real healing. Anya stayed in touch. She was now working with an organization that advocated for the wrongly convicted. She asked him gently if he would consider telling his story more formally, to help others and to shine a light on the flaws in the system he had experienced firsthand. At first, he refused. The thought of reliving it, of making it public, was abhorrent. But the anger, once released, needed a channel. The thought that what happened to him could happen to another Jimmy, another innocent person whose family couldn't afford an Anya Sharma, began to gnaw at him. He started writing. Not a legal account, but the human one. He wrote about the smell of the holding tank, the sound of the cell door, the crushing weight of hopelessness, the surreal horror of the trial. He wrote about the small kindnesses, Marcus's gruff wisdom, his parents' unwavering faith, Anya's brilliant fight. He wrote it all down, purging the poison onto the page. It was agonizing, but it was cathartic. Months passed. He returned to India, to his family's apartment in Delhi. The homecoming was bittersweet. Friends and relatives celebrated his victory, but he could see the unasked questions in their eyes, the slight distance in their demeanor, as if he carried a contagion of bad luck. His old job was gone, filled by someone else. He was a celebrity of the worst kind. He began seeing a therapist,
a gentle woman who specialized in trauma. She gave a name to what he was experiencing, post-traumatic stress. She normalized his reactions, the hypervigilance, the nightmares, the anger, the numbness. Your body and mind endured a profound threat for a very long time, she explained. They learned to be on high alert to keep you alive. They don't just unlearn that because a piece of paper says not guilty. It takes time. Be patient with yourself. The therapy, the writing, and the slow, patient support of his family became the scaffolding for his new life. He finished his manuscript. Anya helped him find a publisher. The book, titled simply The Bag, was released. It was raw, honest, and unflinching. It didn't just tell his story. It dissected the terrifying ease with which an ordinary life can be derailed. It became a modest success, particularly in legal and human rights circles. More importantly, it connected him with other survivors of wrongful accusation, a community of people who understood the particular trauma of being condemned by the system meant to protect you. He began working with Anya's organization, first as a speaker, then as an advocate. He used his story to lobby for reforms, better legal aid for foreign nationals, stricter protocols for handling blind mule cases, more resources for post-exoneration support. The work gave his painful experience a purpose. It didn't erase the scars, but it gave them meaning. A year and a half after the verdict, he had to fly to Singapore for a conference on justice reform. The airport was the final frontier of his fear. For weeks leading up to it, his anxiety spiked. The nightmares returned, but he was determined. He would not let them take this from him too. At the Delhi airport, he checked in his new, bright blue suitcase, a conscious choice to break from the gray. He went through security. His heart pounded as his bag disappeared into the X-ray. The machine beeped. A security officer waved him over. For a second, the world stopped. Then the officer pointed to his belt, still in the tray. "Sir, your belt." It was just the metal buckle, a routine, everyday occurrence. Jimmy collected his things, his hands trembling slightly. He walked to his gate, found a seat, and watched the planes. He was breathing hard, but he was there. He was doing it. As his flight was called, he stood up. He looked out at the massive aircraft that would carry him across the sky. He was not the same man who had boarded a plane to Sydney full of naive excitement. That man was gone. The man who had been broken in a Chicago jail was healing. The man walking toward the gate now was someone new. He was scarred, yes.
He would always carry a caution that bordered on suspicion. He would always feel a chill at the sound of a certain kind of beep. The trust he once placed in the world was forever tempered. But he was also stronger in ways he never could have imagined. He had faced the abyss and walked back from its edge. He had seen the worst of systems and the best of people. He had found a voice in his pain and was using it to try to prevent others from suffering the same fate. He boarded the plane, found his window seat, and fastened his seatbelt. As the plane taxied and then surged into the sky, he looked down at the shrinking world. He was not just leaving a place. He was leaving a version of himself behind. The past was a country he had escaped. The future was an open sky. He was free. Not just from the cell, but from the fear that had been his constant companion. He was moving forward, carrying the weight of his story, not as a burden, but as a compass. The journey was far from over, but for the first time since that fateful day at O'Hare, he was truly, unequivocally, heading home.